Good morning and welcome to today's 20-minute update, BCF's monthly series of live streams to give you an inside look at BCF, our initiatives, the work we're doing in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and the entire region. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Andrew Waldman with BCF, and today we're talking about donor advised funds. Joining me today are Jenn Farrell, Donor Services Officer here at BCF, and Bob Waldman, no relation to me, I want to make that clear. Bob's a co-managing partner at Venable LLP, and he's also BCF's legal counsel. So happy to have both of you here. Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Before we get started, I just want to take a moment. It's actually Giving Tuesday. We thank our Civic Leadership Fund donors who support the 20-minute update and many other projects that we're doing just like this at BCF. So thank you to our Civic Leadership Fund donors. Okay. So today we're talking about donor advised funds. You hear a lot about this in the community foundation field. It's a specialized term, but I just want to, for the audience, first and foremost, ask Bob, can you tell us what a donor advised fund is?
So good morning. So donor advised funds have been around for many years, but it wasn't until fairly recently that the IRS defined what a donor advised fund is. And in the IRS definition, a donor advised fund, or a DAF as it's normally referred to, is simply a fund created at another charity like the Baltimore Community Foundation. And that fund is usually has money in it that has been given by specific donors, and the donors or donor advisors retain advisory privileges over how the money in that fund is either invested or how grants are made out of those funds. So the donor gets to recommend how that money is distributed, but not necessarily direct how those funds are distributed.
Bob just mentioned recommending grants. Jen, I wondered if you might tell us how that's done here at BCF.
Sure. So when you set up your fund at BCF, you'll choose who you want the advisors to be. It could be just you. It could be you and your spouse, you and your children. And then some people make grants throughout the year. Some people make grants one time a year around the holidays. This is a really popular time to do your giving. And we have a really easy system of Donor Connect where you can just log in, fill in the grants you want to send, the purpose you'd like to send them for. Or sometimes people just email us, and as long as we have a record of you recommending a grant, we'll go ahead and send it for you.
Can I jump in here and ask
Sure.
Jen a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
So let's say I set up a fund at BCF, a donor advised fund, and me and my spouse are advisors. Can there be successor advisors, or can other generations advise?
A lot of times we have people name their children as successor advisors, or their family member, a sister or brother. So if something were to happen to them, someone will take over the fund and continue the grant making.
What happens once the last successor has passed away, or there is no successor named in the donor advised fund? What
Sure.
happens then?
So when you set up your fund, we ask that you kind of think about that, what's going to happen to the fund ultimately. So we ask you to think about if there are specific charities you'd like it to continue to support forever, or if you'd like it to go to BCF grant making priorities. So it's just a decision that we try to get you to think about as you're opening the fund.
And another hypothetical, if I set up a donor advised fund, does it have to be a family member that would be an advisor? Can I assign anybody I want?
No, if you have a good buddy that you want to be able to make grant recommendations from your fund, that's absolutely fine.
Great. Bob, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what the attractions of opening a donor advised fund are for a donor.
So, in its most basic, at the most basic level, the number one advantage, I think, of setting up a donor advised fund is its simplicity. It can be done literally in 5 minutes. You come to the donor advised fund, the community foundation, you sign a simple form, literally can be filled out in 5 or 10 minutes, and you're ready to go. And so keep in mind that the money that's contributed to the donor advised fund technically belongs to the donor advised fund. The donor advised fund is itself a charity because it's part of, for example, BCF or the other sponsor of the donor advised fund. And because the money that's contributed to the donor advised fund is really part of the sponsoring charity, You don't have to submit an IRS application for tax-exempt status. You don't have to file tax returns for the fund. Those are simply included inside the sponsoring charities tax return. Probably the biggest attraction of donor-advised funds, and frankly why you see such enormous growth of donor-advised funds around the country, frankly, donor-advised funds are the fastest growing sector of the charitable community, and some of the largest charities in the world are donor-advised funds. But one of the biggest attractions is you can contribute money now to it, get your deduction now, but you don't have to decide the ultimate beneficiary of the fund until later, because you get your deduction up front, and then over time you can decide where you ultimately want the money to go. The other attraction that I use in my own practice of suggesting donor-advised funds is, people always say to me, how much money do I have to put in a private foundation to make it worth forming my own foundation? And again, if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers to that question. In my own experience, I usually tell people, unless you plan on contributing over time at least $1 million to a foundation, it's not really worth it. The administrative headache of running a foundation for less, it's just not worth it. That's a time when donor-advised funds can be very attractive because you remove yourself from all the administration, but get the same advantages you have of setting up your own private foundation.
That's great. Kind of a follow-up to that, are there common scenarios that people that are initiated by individuals to set up a donor-advised fund? What are those scenarios?
So some of the situations I've seen that really call out for a donor-advised fund, there are times when the deduction limits for gifts to a donor-advised fund, because it's deemed to be a public charity, are better than the deduction limits that you get for giving to a private foundation. In particular, if you're giving appreciated assets to a donor-advised fund, quite often the deduction is better than you would get if you were giving it to a family foundation. So if you've got closely held stock or real estate, artwork, sometimes giving that to a donor-advised fund can be advantageous from a tax standpoint. Another time where you'll see donor-advised funds come into play is if you have a private foundation, and private foundations are subject to a rule of every year they have to give away 5% of your assets. You get towards the end of the year, you haven't distributed the 5%, and you're thinking, what should I do? You can distribute money to a donor-advised fund at the community foundation or wherever else from your private foundation to meet your 5% test. So that's current law. We'll see if that remains, but that's another time you see people use donor-advised funds. Again, probably the most common time where I've seen people use donor-advised funds is about this time of year. You get to the end of the year, you realize you're looking for a charitable deduction. You're not quite sure what charity you want to give it to. You can plug money in before December 31. I'm sure you all will be here on December 31.
We will be open
until
5 o'clock. Yep.
But you can contribute to the donor-advised fund before the end of the year, get your deduction, and then figure out later what charities you ultimately want to benefit.
And then you don't have to keep track of all your tax receipts and your list of grants, because we do all that for you.
That's great. I just want to pause for a second and ask if anyone in the audience, either on the phone or on Facebook, has a question. If you're on the phone, you want to hit *6 to unmute your line and then go ahead and ask your question. If you're on Facebook, just go ahead and ask it in the comment section and we will answer it. So does anyone on the phone have a question? Okay, I actually do have one from Facebook, and the question is, can a business use a DAF, a donor-advised fund? And how does that work, I guess?
Sure, and it's fairly common for businesses to do that. It's very similar to the manner that Jen described earlier. The business that wants to do its philanthropy through a charitable vehicle can set up a DAF at anybody who sponsors a DAF, the community foundation or whoever else they prefer to use. Works exactly the same way. The business makes recommendations where they want the grants to go. Now, the one thing that's interesting about a DAF to keep in mind is, although, and let's use BCF as an example. If I set up a DAF at BCF, I can still name it whatever I want to name that fund. So if I'm a company and the company wants to set up the DAF at the community foundation, it can still be named after the company, so that money, and Jen, I don't know how you do this mechanically, when gifts come out of that fund, I assume we acknowledge the company as fund name.
Yeah, the companies can name their fund after them, and it's a lot of times it's smaller companies that maybe don't have a foundation arm. So instead of trying to create a foundation arm of their company, they'll just open a DAF, and sometimes they'll get employee input and make gifts once a year or throughout the year.
Great. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, and the one other thing that's unique to companies that set up DAFs is one role that DAFs play is that quite often they are used, and particularly we've seen this in recent times, if you want to set up an employee disaster relief fund, that's often done through DAFs, a fund that a company sets up that if there's a natural disaster that impacts on their company, employees have been displaced or lost their homes, or, you know, we think about the California situation of lost homes to fires, you can run that kind of fund through a DAF, and you see that fairly often because the DAF can move quickly, you can set it up quickly in times of natural disaster, so it's another use of the donor advised fund.
We actually have a couple more questions. I'm going to ask the last one I just received. This might be for Jen. Would you comment on using the fund, I guess donor advised fund, for multiple small gifts built versus building it up for years to make a major gift to a group?
Sure. So I think the role of community foundations is really to encourage philanthropy in general. So we do encourage people to make, you know, at least a grant every few years of at least $250. Beyond that, there are people that will create a DAF because they want their children to be able to get into philanthropy when they're older. So they'll kind of let it grow and just make smaller grants. But we do have people that will kind of save up a little bit so they can make like a campaign gift or a multi-year gift. You obviously can't make a pledge out of a donor advised fund, but you can sort of, you know, tell an organization that you intend to make a gift every year.
Great. This, I guess, is kind of semi-related to that, but how do we vet grants here at BCF through donor advised funds?
Sure. So before we send any grants, we do like to make sure that they are in good standing with the IRS, that they are a registered 501c3 charity, and that they meet the IRS guidelines, such as you can't, you know, buy a table at a gala. So it just has to be a charitable purpose because your gift into the fund was fully tax deductible.
Great. The questions keep rolling in. You all are very popular. This is another question from Facebook. The question is, how can nonprofits reach out to donor advised funds to educate them about their programs and services in hopes of accessing their grant funds? That's a question we get all the time.
Yeah. So what we try to do encourage people to do is look at our annual report, bring it to your board, and just see if they recognize anyone, you know, on our list. We don't actively approach fund holders unless there's already a relationship between the charity. So it is really just kind of using your network to access who you know that you know has a fund at BCF.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, Jen, let me follow up on, you know, one of the things I think is very interesting about the whole donor advised fund model is it gives the power of leveraging multiple donors together. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you have your own foundation, you might make a grant, say, to someone of $10,000, but let's say there's a need, you know, in the city or whatever that needs significant amounts of dollars. I've always thought one of the interesting things about the donor advised fund model is you can bring together, you get a need, you publicize a need that's out there that you know, the community foundation or whoever learns about, and multiple donors. It's almost like a mini GoFundMe page in a way.
Yeah, when we did the Fund for Rebuilding Baltimore, after the unrest, we had a lot of our fund holders come together and give to that fund to help get Baltimore back on track.
Great. I want to go to my next question. We have a couple more online questions, but we talked a little bit, Bob talked a little bit about the difference between private foundations and donor advised funds. Bob, I wondered, and Jen too, if you could tell us a little bit more about the trade-offs between starting a donor advised fund and opening up a private foundation.
So with a private foundation, and there are times and places for each. And in a private foundation, you have to form a separate corporation with its own board of directors, bylaws, all that stuff. Apply to the IRS for exempt status, file an annual tax return. Donor advised funds don't have to do any of those things. It's because that's all done at the sponsoring charity. Private foundations have to pay a 2% tax on investment income. Donor advised funds don't. Private foundations have to distribute 5% of their assets each year. Donor advised funds don't. So you can accumulate money there. There's no, you don't have to have the separate board meetings that come with a private foundation. You don't do that at a donor advised fund. But what you give up at a donor advised fund, because it's not all on one side or the other, you give up some control when you set up a donor advised fund, because technically the money that is contributed belongs to the donor advised fund. In theory, the sponsor of the donor advised fund could veto a grant recommendation made by the advisor. In my experience, having done this a long time, I think I've almost never seen in any of the donor advised funds I'm familiar with, almost never seen anyone veto a recommendation unless it was absolutely something insane. And even then, not sure I've seen it done. So, in its simplest terms, what you're in the foundation, which can be a wonderful, family model and can be a great way of structuring giving. What you get with a donor advised fund is simplicity. You give up some control to get that simplicity.
Yeah, I think not having to deal with all the back office stuff, and like I mentioned, keeping track of all the grants you make every year. I mean, we kind of do all that. We check their status with the IRS, so it kind of takes a little bit of the burden off of having to run an organization and hire staff.
Yeah, and we do convert private foundations to donor advised funds here. What do you hear from those families that have done that about
Sure.
the differences?
I think a lot of times it's there could be times when the foundation has gotten smaller than when they started it. Maybe the children aren't as interested as they hoped to be. So it's just kind of an easier way to have it here so that we have to, worry about all the stuff you have to worry about, and can just make it a little bit of a cleaner process, when you don't really want to have that whole back office operation.
Jen, one of the things I always hear is, be interested in your thoughts, is when people are deciding whether to do a donor advised fund versus their own foundation, is the investment of how assets will get invested. And some people will say, look, I want to have my own foundation because I want to control the investments. You particularly see this with people who are investment savvy. How does that work at a donor advised fund in terms of how do I get to participate in the investment of my fund?
Sure. So we have our regular money market pool, and then we have our BCF pool, which is a little bit more aggressive. So it's really up to your preference. If you're thinking that you want to put this money in and you just want to grant it out and you're not worried about returns, a lot of people will do money market. But if it is those families that kind of want to see it grow a little bit, they'll do the BCF pool so that they can maybe, grow some dollars for their children or themselves to give away.
Okay, I want to jump back to our questions. We have a couple more from Facebook. And also, if you're on the phone right now and you want to ask a question, I'd say this is your last chance. Hit *6 to unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, these are a couple more nuts and bolts questions. The first question is, can I make a grant to an organization through BCF that is not in Baltimore?
Absolutely. Like I said, we support philanthropy in general. We love Baltimore, and most of our fund holders do primarily give in Baltimore. But there are those families that have a child in Rhode Island that wants to give to Rhode Island causes, and that's absolutely fine. As long as it's a 501c3, we'll allow it.
Great. This is maybe I'll expand this question a little bit, but what does an individual need to have to start a donor advised fund at BCF?
Sure. So our minimum is $10,000 to open a fund. But other than that, it's pretty simple. You need to think of a name, what you'd like to call it, decide who you want to be able to make requests from the fund, grant recommendations, and that's basically it. You'll decide some basic questions like how you want your grant letters to be sent to the organization, if you want your address on it, or if you want to be totally anonymous. But other than that, it's literally a 5 to 10 minute process.
Wow. I guess we should have had a contest to see how fast you can open a donor advised fund, 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, we're coming right up on 9:20 right now, so I'm going to say that we have finished up. I want to thank Bob Waldman for joining us from Venable LLP. We really appreciate you giving us that very deep background on donor advised funds. Jenn Farrell from BCF Donor Services. Just want to remind everyone that we will be open on Christmas Eve and on New Year's Eve until 5 p.m. So if you want to open a donor advised fund, you can do that.
I'll be here.
Great. So once again, thanks to our Civic Leadership Fund donors for making this call possible. If you want to sign up to get updates on our future 20-minute updates, go to bcf.org/enews and sign up there. We'll be back in December. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.